Welcome back everybody, and today we're going to be doing a bit of a comparison looking at the Army Painter Warpaints aero set that I purchased from the outset, and perhaps it wasn't a great idea not having any idea what I was doing, but at the end of the day there was a large amount of paints. It seemed like a great idea, but clearly one of the things that you're possibly going to encounter is not knowing what the colors are going to look like when they're actually used. And I've only painted probably a handful of models, and I thought it would be a good idea to do a bit of a comparison with some of the colors that they have to get an idea of what they physically look like on models, and to give you a bit of an idea of how the whole system kind of works. The Army Painter Air Mega Set, it comes with about 60 paints, and there's actually 16 color triad groups, and ultimately the way Army Painter works is they provide these triads that have a highlight, a midtone, and a base. And I guess the major concept that they were providing was to allow you to airbrush, because they are called airbrush the paints onto the models. Obviously this is a relatively quick way to do things, and the concept was to put a base down and then come in with successive layers of the midtone and highlight, covering less and less of the model to provide somewhat of like a zenithal highlight with colors. And that's probably not a bad idea, but I decided to do something totally different, and sort of following on the theme from the previous couple of videos that I've done, looking at the sort of the Grimdark color process that Travarian Miniatures has used. The system of applying the paint is actually via brush and sponge, and primarily by sponge. And so I thought I would choose some of the color triads that were available, particularly green, purple, red and yellow, to try these out and see what sort of coloration we get, check the contrast difference, see if the highlight is that much of a highlight that it's actually useful. And so the idea is to apply these to the progressive models. So I've just chosen some Space Marines because I've got a bag load of them, and these surfaces are large enough that I thought, well, this might actually work on these. And first things first, I guess some people tell you, oh, okay, put the paint on thickly, put it thin down. And from my experience playing with these paints, even though they are air paints and already pre-thin to go into an airbrush, I still think they probably are a little bit thicker than what you would like if you're going to be applying them using a sponge. Now there's different types of sponges you can use. I used a makeup sponge, which is a little bit denser, rather than using sort of an open cell kind of foam filter type sponge, and that does put more paint on. It is somewhat of a slow process, you will find, and you want to go progressively. You don't want to try and do it all at once, particularly if you're trying to preserve the dark recess shading without having to go back in and do too much touch-ups afterwards. The whole idea of Travarian's process was to undercoat in black, so everything obviously is uniform, and that provides your shadows, and then you just layer the color progressively over there, working up to your highlights, which are then sort of generally on smaller surfaces. And it pays to be somewhat careful with your application, and also you don't want to apply the paint too wet. And this is from my experience anyway, the way I found it. And I effectively watered down the paint slightly to thin it, and then dab the sponge into the paint. And the first model I did here was the yellow one, and just playing with that initially, it was probably a little bit too wet when I was putting it on, because it did actually enter into a lot of the panel lines, which I was trying to limit. But placement of that around edges and everything, if you're careful, at least you can preserve some of the darkness, which gives that sort of progressive gradient to the dark tones, which is the image we're trying to portray of a dark, dingy kind of model. So applying it, just go slowly, be cautious, I guess, with the amount of paint that you physically have on the sponge, so that it's not too heavily loaded, and just dab it on progressively. Now with the yellow and with the green, the yellow is quite transparent clearly, and the green you could barely see any change, because depending upon the Triad system that you choose, the base colors can be quite dark, and over black it's very difficult to actually see what you've done, except for looking for something that's actually wet. And with the yellow, I found that it took some time to actually get the color to be apparent, because it's also quite transparent. And what this process has told me is it's not particularly fast, unlike the Triad system, which says it's super efficient and you'll be able to get your armies onto the table in no time. Using this sponge approach takes quite a bit of time, and even though there's only 3 paints, I didn't want to do just 3 layers, and that clearly wasn't going to work anyway. And so I typically found that you apply probably at least 2 coats of the one highlight or base coat or mid-tone to get enough density of the color so that it actually appears like you've done something. So starting with the base, you probably put a couple down, and you want to progress or have a transgression from one to the other. And so it pays to have an intermediate step, and therefore mixing of the paints from the base to the mid and the mid to the high gives us ultimately 5 different sort of levels of color change, so that at least we are layering, and therefore it can take up to 10 applications of apply paint, let it dry, put another coat on, apply paint, let it dry, ad infinitum, until you actually get to where you can then start detailing the model. So it is a slow, laborious process, but you don't have to be so screamingly precise as you would be with a brush perhaps. Now the benefit of using the sponge system over, say, spraying it on or brushing it on directly is the texture that you get, that I've noticed. If you paint something or airbrush is great because you get very smooth application of the paint, but using the sponge method gives you a texture, and that texture gives it a sort of a gritty character because you're having lumps and bumps. It's a bit like an orange peel application rather than actually just a smooth thin coat, and that provides all these little micro details that add character to the model that you wouldn't ordinarily get. And plus also you're applying it not evenly, and therefore you get to see some of the colors of the base coats coming through, which fits in well with the sort of grimdark aesthetic of dirty armor, as opposed to something that's nice and fresh straight off the production line. Now, one thing I did notice with the yellows, the yellow appears to be quite chalky. I've encountered this before with yellows and oranges. It would appear that it's quite a sort of a dusty, thick paint for some reason. It must obviously be the compound that's in there. The pigments are obviously a little bit sort of bigger or something, I don't know. And you do get a sort of more build-up, it appears, on the surface, rather than more of just a constant layer. Or at least in my impression, that seems to be what it is. But ultimately, once you've done the sponging, which realistically is probably maybe 3 or 4 steps in terms of applying both the base, the mixed base mid-tone, the mid-tone, and then maybe when you're getting towards the mid-tone mixing with the highlight, then you can start using the brush to apply specifically, because at that point we're trying to actually show where the highlights are, and we're going to start doing some of the edge highlighting to try and indicate precisely where the bright parts of the model are. So just picking out those areas, and typically you need some form of light map or something to get an idea. Maybe hold the model directly underneath a light source and sort of try and visualize where the brightest points are on the model, and use that as a reference for you. And obviously, depending upon how you turn the model will change where those light source or the light source will fall on the models. And so you can either do them all the same for uniformity, or you can mix it up a little bit, which is what I sort of did. And you just keep working away at the models, trying to build them up, and then at the end we have just the need to go in there and play around with doing all the final details. on them, which in this case was sort of doing the belts, the leather and everything, and eyes, aquillas, weapons, and because I'd chosen different colours, there was variety, and it was just trying different options with these guys just to see what worked out. I did end up doing all the eyes the same because I thought, well, I'll just have some degree of consistency across them, make it look like the United Colours of Benetton, that sort of thing, and they're all at least joined together. And it was just picking out certain elements and trying to give them a little bit of character, following some of the groupings. So previously I'd done what I thought was a Blood Angel, and I'd chosen the darker red sort of triad that was available, and that was the Rebel Red, Chaotic Red and Traitor Red. And this time I decided to use the Carmine Pure and Archangel Red to try and actually get more of a red colour rather than the sort of the dark purpley colour that I had. And that worked relatively well. It seemed to be more consistent, and I obviously chose the yellow. Purple, no idea who's supposed to be purple, but I thought I'd give that colour a bit of a go to get an idea of perhaps how that's going to look. But it's probably not going to be a colour that would be used all that often, I don't imagine. And the lucky last was the green, and the green seems to be somewhat popular at the moment, with L. Johnson being released. So I thought, okay, well, we'll give that a go. There was 3 different green triads available, and I chose probably the darker of the 3, with the Unforgiven Green, Angel Green and Exile Green. It would appear that sort of the mid-tones look more orc-like, with the Savage Green, Green Skin and Feral Green colour choices. And then there was more of a sort of a, if you like, a sort of, well, the terms they use are Psychic, Elemental and Majestic Fortress sort of thing. So it's kind of more of a tealy kind of vibrant green, which didn't look particularly good. So I thought that's probably not an applicable colour that we can choose. So ultimately that was the 4 colours that I went with to try and at least get an idea of how these colours look on a model. And then the last idea was, well, okay, there's also a lot of browns and we've got to do the bases. And I thought to myself, perhaps we can experiment with those colours as well to see if we can differentiate how they work out just colouring the bases. The bases were undercoated as the models were in black, and they were just brushed on. I didn't use any sponging because I had based all of the models just using a Mod Podge adhesive and dumping them into sand, different grades of sand to get sort of fine to coarse, to give them all sort of consistent sort of look. And sponging that on wouldn't have been particularly great. And most instances when people paint bases, they sort of do some uniform complete plastered colour where you don't see any dark. And I thought, well, look, if I water the paint down, dab it on to some extent, I might be able to preserve some of that sort of shadow, but it also depends on just how wet you put the paint on, and at times, yeah, it's probably a little bit too wet, but you don't want to do an entire dry brush over the whole thing. I was going to save that for the highlights, and so I grabbed 4 options, 3 browns, or sort of brown, pale, and then went to a grey. And thought I'll see how they work out. Now some of the browns actually start quite dark and their highlight isn't particularly much of a highlight, and once you start dabbing the paint on over black, you can clearly see that the colour isn't particularly obvious. Again, the paint is somewhat thinned down, so that dark base coat does show through, and it's just a matter then of going in and just doing a sort of a semi-dry brush with the mid-tone colour. So there's only 3 applications of paint on these rather than doing 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sort of thing. And with sort of the mid-tones, yeah, got a little bit liberal with some of the paintwork and just slapped it on. But because it's actually quite thinned down, it tends to sort of thin out, and you can still see the base through it relatively well. So look, this is just all experimentation. But I did notice that once putting on the highlights on some of these, using more of a proper dry brush, there wasn't a particularly large contrast, and everyone says with small models, contrast, and that's what we should be pushing, and therefore it requires a little bit of sort of contribution to go in there and maybe add a little bit more or lighten the paint even further. So while there is a triad system, it sometimes pays to even either lighten the paint a little bit further or go in with an even lighter color, which is why I generally use the sort of the bleached bone, skeleton bone as highlights, because they're sort of an earthy tone. They are quite light, and it's not as bad as white, obviously, but it's certainly something quite bright. And what I did find with the one that I put underneath my little yellow guy was that I went in and actually used some of that yellow paint as a bit of a highlight on the base. It adds a bit of consistency between the model and the base, and brightened it up, because the dark brown that I had chosen was probably a little bit too dark to physically see any differentiation, and it looked quite muddy. So just brighten those bases up, and at the end of the day, once they're all sitting there, they actually look quite good from a distance, clearly, and I was relatively happy with sort of the experimentation to get an idea of how to use these colors and how they will actually turn out. Clearly there's 16 different sets, and I've only looked at 8 of them here. I had used 2 previously on a couple of the videos that I've done, so all up I've tried a fair amount of the colors to get an idea of how they look. And this is really hasn't been an how-to, more a case of this is what I did and this is what I found as I went through the process, and hopefully it has been somewhat useful to someone if they are going to try and use these paints rather than sort of the conventional color choices that come through the Games Workshop color range, because clearly you can get somewhat close, I would guess, and at the end of the day the color is representative of the model, and because as many people say, paint them the way you want, this gives you that opportunity to have a little bit of variety and experiment and see what you like best. And that was really for me as well. Got an army to paint at some point, and I'm just trying to work out which colors are going to look the best on the models, and this was certainly an opportunity to try that out. So thanks again for watching, and see you in the next one.